welcome everyone to this ESCoE webinar. I'm Paul Misnon. I'm a member of the ESCoE Leadership Executive, and today we've got a presentation by Kurz, who's an Assistant Director in the Division of Research and Statistics at the Federal Reserve Board, Washington, DC. So Chris has interests in forecasting industrial production, motor vehicle sales, and coordinating the GDP forecast for the board. And he's also been working at the Federal Reserve Board's expanded measurement agenda, which aims to identify novel data sources and leverage new techniques that could be used to develop timely and accurate measures of economic activity that are relevant to the formation of monetary policy. In his presentation today, he's going to blend these two areas together, and the title is Manufacturing Sentiment, Forecasting Industrial Production with Text Analysis. So I'll hand over to Chris, and following that, Hannah Finkelstein from the ONS will be the discussant, and we'll open up the Q&A after that. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A chat. So over to you, Chris. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks to Hannah, and thanks to Sarah and all the folks at ESCoE for helping facilitate this seminar. Give a couple second introduction and then kind of jump into the slides. But wanted to just say first, foremost, like any comments are welcome on this. This paper has been something we've been working on for a few years, and we're kind of wrestling with some revisions right now. And really, I think the important kind of part to convey in the background is that, and this is going to be a theme I return to several times, is that this is not just just a research project. It's really been sort of a, at the board, we've been kind of working with the Institute of Supply Management for quite a few years, and particularly a few years on this project, which is really, not just a way of thinking about how to kind of leverage text for forecasting, but to sort of better understand what's happening in the economy, and not only be able to sort of answer some really important research questions, but to then sort of build a relationship with an organization and create a data feed that we can use for policy purposes and economic measurement as well. So let me start with the slides, and then go from there. All right, so paper's Manufacturing Sentiment. It's a joint work with several co-authors here at the Federal Reserve Board, Tomasz, Norm, Leland, Paul, and Betsy. And again, one of the end results of this would be to kind of set up, let's say, a pipeline with an organization to ingest data that we can use for policy purposes and understand, let's say, more than just the numerical answers we get from an organization's publication. And I'll make that a little bit more clear in a bit, but this sounds a lot like a forecasting paper, and that's true, but like I said earlier, it's also an economic measurement paper. So it's great to have some comments and responses from folks at the ONS and other listeners. It's really a paper to say that there can be additional information that can be layered on to some numerical measures. And what do I mean by that? Well, the Institute for Supply Management, the ISM, publishes numerical metrics on multiple facets of, let's say, manufacturing and non-manufacturing sectors of the economy. But at the same time, they collect text responses, kind of free-form text responses. And those text responses are fairly parsimonious. In a way that there's about 16 words on average in terms of these text responses provided by organizations. So you can imagine collecting a survey, collecting numerical responses, and at the same time having some free-form text that is provided. And our question really at the beginning was, is there additional information in that text that can complement or supplement the actual numerical responses? So that's really the question that we want to get to, and that really, to us, would help us better understand the value of text and extracting sentiment from text, which are important questions. So what are we going to be doing today? Well, we're going to be evaluating natural language processing for classifying sentiment. So really kind of think about the different uses and different NLP techniques you can leverage to classify sentiment. Once we get these sentiment measures that we extract from these free-form text responses, we're going to be seeing if we can forecast industrial production with them. And that's going to help us better understand why text matters. So the outline for today is going to be sort of reviewing the ISM data that I've been talking about and the IP data, talking about measuring sentiment using different NLP techniques, doing forecasting exercises, and interpreting transformer-based results. And so kind of the preview results and kind of the overall result, I would say, is that we're able to reconfigure. We're able to essentially measure the numerical measures using text. So we can recreate a numerical statistical product by just looking at the free-form text responses, which I think is an important kind of conclusion of this paper. In terms of classifying sentiment, we find that dictionaries exhibit poor performance. Transformer-based models are going to be better at kind of examining sentiment. And those transformer-based models, really, it allows you to understand things like order in context, and that's going to be an important part in understanding, let's say, economic free-form text responses. We're going to find that text improves forecasting. So in addition to having numerical answers, being able to look at some free-form text associated with numerical answers actually improves your forecasting abilities. These sentiment indices are based on dictionaries, but they don't perform as well, let's say, as the sentiment indices based on transformer models or deep learning models, and that's going to be an important thing to kind of extract from here. And then importantly, at the end, we're able to say, okay, look, we have these sentiment measures. We know that it's based on these deep learning models, but it's really hard to kind of parse this sort of black box that is transformer models to understand what's driving sort of this ability to recreate a statistical index using only free-form text responses. So we're able to actually deeply dive into these transformer models to come up with, let's say, the important words that drive that variation, and then can recreate an index with only, let's say 10% of the words that are in the aggregate and used. So how do we fit within the literature? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just understand that there's a lot of work that thinks about sort of taking sentiment from text, and there's also a lot of work that thinks about forecasting. And we're trying to bridge these two places. And the important reason we're kind of focusing on industrial production is, one, for this paper, we're going to be singularly looking at the manufacturing sector, even though kind of part of our pipeline with the ISM involves non-manufacturing data, but that's more of a future project. But industrial production, it's an important business cycle indicator. It's a good target for forecasting. You see it show up in lots of forecasting papers, lots of sort of factor analysis, and it's a really good long time series of data that allows sort of business cycle fluctuations to be studied, and that's one of the reasons we look at it. I'll get back to that a little bit more later. But first, let's talk about this ISM data I've been rambling on about. So our main data is from the Institute of Supply Management. It's called the ISM. They've been running surveys since the 1930s to get a better idea of what's happening in the economy. They talk to supply managers. They get their feedback on certain questions, which I'll talk about in a second. And the important thing is it's really the first available information on the national economy for a given quarter. So typically at the first of the month, the ISM releases the manufacturing ISM index, and then a few days later they receive the non-manufacturing ISM index. And those indices provide some type of forward-looking or nowcasting power about what's happening in the overall economy. The survey contacts about 100 to 300 purchasing managers. Now I'm thinking just about the manufacturing ISM data that we'll be focusing on within this paper. It covers the manufacturing sector. They actually have detailed 3-digit NAICS for the individual responses. So you can imagine a purchasing manager at a ball bearing facility will respond to the ISM survey, and that will get categorized into its particular industry code. The survey asks about operations and economic conditions. Really, they want to know about what's happening this month relative to last month. The purchasing managers complete a form, basically categorical responses for whether or not particular variables increase, decrease, or stay the same. But at the end of this, and at the end of each categorical response, you're allowed to sort of riff. You're allowed to answer an open-ended response, so you're given some type of ability to provide a written explanation in these comment fields. And so for each individual variable, there's a comment field, and then there's a general one at the end that individuals will be able to fill in. So it's a very well curated survey. And just to kind of a little bit to push a little bit further on this, the ISM does a great job of sort of curating it and keeping the purchasing managers and the supply managers kind of in the sample and responding. So, we're in kind of this world in which we're seeing some massive declines in response rates and initiation rates. And one thing I'll say is that the ISM does a really good job of kind of maintaining that panel so that they get consistent answers over time. Our data is going to be from 2001 to 2020 for this paper. So what are the questions that are asked about operations in the ISM survey? Again, this is about the current month relative to the last month. So essentially, they put, for the numerical answers, they're going to be putting together sort of a diffusion index. They ask about production, new orders, orders backlog, employment, supplier delivery times, input inventories, exports, and imports. So it really kind of covers the gamut of what's happening at the firm, the business level. Now let's think a little bit about this sort of free-form text. Most of the data that we're going to be looking at is sort of the free-form text responses. And when they publish a release for a particular month, they usually provide a few free-form text responses to add context to the individual data release. And these come from the publicly available data. The first one is basically them saying, look, a slowdown in new housing construction and concerns for a slowing economy have customers delaying purchases in an effort to destock. And that would be from kind of the chemical products industry. Second example is, while there are lingering concerns about a recession, we're not expecting a large drop-off in manufacturing this year. The worst case is flat. So these are kind of a few examples of the text that we'll be trying to examine the sentiment on. And I think one of the first things that should jump out at you is that, like, it's very specific text to a particular sector and the manufacturing industry. So, if you're thinking about extracting sentiment, you have to really kind of think about the dictionary you'll be using and the context that it's written in, and what that says about the overall economy, and and how particular the language is in terms of thinking about how you can extract sentiment from it. So again, our data goes from 2001 to 2020. We do have post-pandemic paper data for analysis, but we're restricting this to kind of pre-pandemic for several reasons. One, I think a lot of correlations kind of broke during the pandemic. Two, the last thing we need is another pandemic-related research paper. But importantly, I think that we have a long enough time series to think about here. Pre-pandemic, several business cycles, so it's kind of an important long time series. It's monthly data. We basically have 42,000 firm month observations. Thinking about the time series. Now, what is this? This really actually, so the first plot I showed here is just new orders over time, and the gray shaded areas are the US business cycles. Now, with this time series figure I'm showing you now, basically shows you what do we see in the text responses. So kind of the dark shaded area is your non-empty responses. So think of the light shaded area. So it's kind of the percent of firms as being sort of the empty responses. And you'll see that there's a good fraction of individuals who will always be adding text in each month. What we see, though, is that black line, and that's kind of the number of words in those responses. And like I said, it averages about 16, but you can see that it fluctuates over time, which is important. You kind of see that, during periods prior to, let's say, a cyclical shift, you see more words. And during periods of, let's say, policy uncertainty, you see things like more words. And importantly, you kind of see this jump around 2018. What we do here is we decompose it a little bit further to say, okay, well, why do we see this jump in 2018? Was there a massive shift in the sample? And, and where we fall in this is that you see a lot of kind of trade-related topics coming to the fore at that time because there were some policy changes. And so in 2018, the individual words that manufacturing establishments were writing have jumped quite a bit, and most of that was due to concerns about trade and tariffs. All right, so now we're going to kind of move to our target of interest, which is industrial production. Again, we're going to be trying to think about forecasting in this framework, but forecasting as an exercise to show the value of text. So we're going to be forecasting manufacturing output growth. IP is a monthly output index. It's really, in my mind, kind of your first big data product. It's been published by the Federal Reserve for upwards of 100 years. And it combines private sector data with public data for benchmarking or for kind of non-physical product type series. Again, it's a monthly output index. It's assembled using micro-labeled resources. It's very cyclical, so kind of the MBR, which is our sort of business cycle dating committee, will be focused on IP to figure out what's happening in the overall economy. And again, like I said, it's a long time series of monthly data, which is particularly why a lot of time series econometricians and forecasters like to leverage it, because you get that kind of nice long statistical properties from that data source. And the figure I'm showing here is industrial production for the manufacturing sector in red and total IP in black. And total IP is manufacturing, mining, and utility. So, but what we're going to be focusing on is the red line, because that covers just the manufacturing sector. And so does the ISM data that we'll be looking at. So turning to kind of the forecasting exercises, what are we going to be forecasting? Nothing really surprising or out of the box here, but we're just going to be forecasting IP, current IP for the manufacturing sector. So that's fully revised current vintage growth rates, because the IP series does revise. Forecasting that based on sort of lags of what you'd have in your hands, what the econometrician would have in their hands at a particular point in time. And so that would be 3 lags of IP, plus sort of the ISM metrics that we're going to be including. So that's going to be sort of that delta XT is going to be the ISM metrics. And again, really, if you really kind of want to break this down, think about taking the ISM published numerical index, which we're going to call the PMI index, and then seeing how good a job that does in forecasting IP, and then kind of running a horse race and seeing whether or not, if you add the sentiment metric, that adds any additional information to it. So typically at the board, we kind of, if we're trying to forecast industrial production, we'll just say, have some lags and then have the ISM measure. And really kind of what this paper is doing is saying, let's throw in 2 variables into XT, not just sort of the published ISM measures, but throw in the published measures and our extracted sentiment measures, which come from text. So we've run a multitude of different specifications, so I'm not going to be focusing on all of them here. But one thing to kind of point out is one of the sort of issues we've been tackling with is that if you can just extract general sort of newspaper sentiment, does it also add value? And the answer is yes. So you get quantitatively similar results for including newspaper sentiment. So now let's think a little bit about what we're doing with sentiment, kind of take a deeper dive into different sentiment measures and discuss how we do that, and then kind of show our sentiment metrics. And again, like I said in the beginning, it's not just, we're not just thinking, okay, we're trying to just do this really improved forecasting exercise. We're trying to see how you can extract sentiment and how that presents and aggregates into a measure that can be compared to those other numerical measures. And we'll kind of get to that once we kind of work through what we mean by measuring sentiment and kind of overview how we actually do it. So again, we're going to be trying to extract positive, neutral, and negative sentiment from these individual comments. Recall I said that we're seeing about 16 words on average per text response, so kind of parsimonious text. We're not going through a whole newspaper to get sentiment. We're getting sentiment from about 16 words on average, and we're going to be saying, is this positive, neutral, or negative? From the individual survey responses that we extract sentiment from, we kind of aggregate that, average it over all the respondents in a given month, and then we'll be using that to forecast with. So the first thing we're going to do is for sentiment is we're going to use sort of the old school, and saying old school sounds a little bit strange given a lot of these techniques aren't that dated, but it kind of also says how quickly technology changes. So each comment is going to be treated as a bag of words. These are the dictionary type methods. We're going to be using a specific dictionary that gives each word a value, typically sort of some positive, negative, or zero type scalar. There's the Harvard and AFIN dictionaries. They're really kind of general purpose, social media focused dictionaries. And the important thing you'll see as we kind of go through this paper is that sort of these general dictionary approaches really just don't have the language tuned to what you'd think either businesses or economists would be placing value on a particular word. So they'd kind of give things different values. There's also more complicated, a little bit more specialized dictionaries. Longham and McDonald and the financial stability dictionaries come to mind, and they were going to be ones we're using. They're specialized dictionaries. They're kind of more focused on finance and accounting. And the financial stability one is really based on central bank financial stability reports. So they kind of provide dictionary approaches, but with more specialized language. And again, like I said, we're going to be averaging these word scores to get a sentiment score for each individual comment. Large language models provide a little bit more capability in terms of trying to assign sentiment scores. They account for things like grammar and their context depending. We're going to be using BERT. And that was published in 2018, which seems pretty recent, but in terms of how quickly technology is moving right now, it's actually ancient. This is one of those papers that when we first started it and first kind of thought of the forecasting exercises, we were really at kind of the front of the research and the technology, and you'll see that now most people would be using sort of generative AI to do some of this work. But large language models are essentially, they're neural networks. They're mostly transformers. Each word gets represented by a vector. This is where kind of this order matters. Kind of one dimension for sentiment, but there's also dimensions for, say, past, future, what the tense is, how words relate. And this kind of goes to that attention mechanism. It really allows for the interaction of words, shifting focus, etc. The large language models, kind of pre-trained models that we'll be leveraging here is going to be FinBERT and FinBERT2. And really, it's kind of like the original BERT, but it's going to be fine-tuned or trained on particular SEC filings for FinBERT v1. FinBERT v2 is kind of the original BERT weights, but it's also going to be fine-tuned on financial news from Reuters and allows sort of sentiment to be classified better. Both of these models are trained on data from the financial world. But what's interesting here is that even though we can say this is more specialized to particular financial and economic language, it really is not trained on sort of what manufacturing organizations might say about their current environment. So because these comments that we're looking at are things about backlogs and inventories and productions and production, and so it might even be a little bit more specialized. So what we do is we kind of take this a step further and train, kind of fine-tune our own large language models. And some of these kind of large language models that we'll be training is basically taking BERT and then fine-tuning it a bit further. And so how do we actually do that? I'll kind of skip over some of this more transformer description and go to how we're going to be training our own large language models. And we're going to be doing some human labeling in the background. And so what do I mean by this? Well, we had 2 economists hand label 1,000 comments for sentiment, basically saying, like, is this positive, neutral, or negative? And kind of the decision rule we used for this fine-tuning was whether or not this comment, so basically read the comment, is it consistent with manufacturing IP rising month over month? 2 economists agreed on about 700 comments, so 70% is not so bad. We trained on the ones that were agreed upon, and then we kept kind of a holdout sample for evaluation. And there's really 2 ways of doing this. So let's say you have comments that you've hand labeled for being positive, neutral, or negative. You can basically fine-tune BERT, basically take the pre-existing BERT models, layer in this 700 comments in which they were agreed upon, and use that to kind of train the model a little bit further. That's what we're going to be calling fine-tuned BERT, human labeled. It's really the original BERT weights, but fine-tune on these individual labels. You can also train your own model without layering it onto BERT, and we're going to be calling that transformer small, TF small. And it's really just taking a large language model and training it on the individual responses that we've created here. There's going to be one other way of thinking about this, and you can use, let's say, the time series nature of the data we have individual identifiers, so we know how organizations respond month to month. So we kind of have this panel structure. So you can apply the panel structure and say, look, I don't have to answer this question about whether or not this comment is consistent with manufacturing IP rising month over month. I know what next month answer is, so I can decide on whether or not production increased. So we basically do a transformal model on the production data, and these are naturally occurring labels. Essentially, what I mean by that is that, with that panel data in hand, we know what your next month production is going to be. So we can train a model on whether or not your text is consistent with production increasing next month, given production is increasing next month. So this will be another fine-tuned BERT model. Basically, we call it fine-tuned BERT production data. Really, again, original BERT weights, but fine-tuned basically on the panel nature of production. Right, so that's our different models. I'll review those more in a second. But let's think a little bit about sort of what our forecasting scenarios are going to be, or what's our time series. For out of sample, we're going to be sort of thinking about 2018 through 2020 as our out of sample period. Use 2001 to 2017 kind of to fine tune these models. We're also trying to think about changing our out of sample time periods to sort of not kind of cherry pick a particular given point in time. So we're working on an additional model that doesn't just train on 2001 to 2017, that trains on 2001 to 2014. So different kind of evaluation period for the out of sample periods to try to make sure that we have multiple out of sample periods that can be looked at to show that you get improvement in forecasting without looking at one individual time period. All right, so what are all the sentiment measures I just sort of ran through? Our dictionary measures are Harvard, AFIN, LM, and financial stability. Our transformer-based models are FinBERT, our FinBERT using human label data, and then our fine-tuned BERT models using human label data and the production data. So let's kind of quickly run through an example of classifying sentiment. Look at a comment and see how it gets scored. Is this sentence going to be positive, negative, or neutral? And, keeping in mind that the dictionary methods go through individual words in a comment, kind of give them a value, and then you add up those different values. And the BERT models really look at the whole sentence. So you can't say an individual word has a particular score when you're trying to look at some of the BERT models without going through a little bit more extensive work, which we'll do towards the end of this presentation. So the example I'm giving you is demand has been higher than capacity. If you kind of human code that, so when our individuals looked at it, it was coded as positive. But if you look at the individual words, you'll see the first three lines are going to be able to say, look, you score words. The FinBERT V1, FinBERT V2, and fine-tuned BERT are grayed out here because it's really hard to think about giving individual word scores and aggregating them. But essentially, you'll see that the Harvard and stability measures kind of give that sentence neutral. But if you think about AFIN, it says it's actually negative. Reading demand has been higher than capacity to me means that, look, we're seeing strong demand. We're not able to produce that much, but, we're probably going to increase capacity in the future. That's a positive statement from an organization. And you'll see that the three transformer models actually classify that as positive. Again, the dictionaries kind of say either this is neutral or negative. And that would not be the right conclusion you want to draw from that important piece of information. Another way of thinking about, how we can compare the dictionary methods to the
Sorry, there seems to be somebody speaking on the call. Maybe you could turn your microphone off. Thanks.
There's definitely a question I would not be able to answer. So kind of this table really presents a summary of the different sentiment measures and activity measures. I think the thing to kind of take away from it is, again, when you look at the LM, Harvard, AFIN, and stability dictionaries, and even FinBERT V1 and V2, you're kind of getting close to zero or negative sort of mean sentiment measures over this time period. So again, looking at that first or second column, kind of looking at the mean, the transformer small and the fine-tuned BERTs are actually going to give you positive sentiment over this time period. And you're probably thinking, okay, Chris, why do we care about whether or not it's positive or negative? Well, the important thing would be to go down to the macro variables and look at IP growth. And you'll see for IP growth, basically we're seeing about 3% growth over this time period, which is positive. Not, I mean, 3% growth is about a little bit higher than average for IP over history, or close to average for IP over history. So you really want to think about sentiment measures that are kind of at least the right sign. And so being neutral or negative is probably not the right type of sentiment measure to be extracting here. And so we're seeing these sort of transformer models, particularly the small and fine-tuned ones, giving us kind of the right magnitude of sentiment. And I wouldn't take too much in the actual kind of size of those means, but at least think a little bit more about how the sign is telling you something about that sector. Given time, I'm going to skip over this, but basically we kind of go through accuracy, comparing sort of the human labeled to how the individual dictionaries might show you what that individual, let's say, response is, positive or negative or neutral. And you're going to see the transformer models do a really good job, particularly when we think about it being rescaled to take out neutrals, of telling us what is kind of the sentiment of an individual sentiment, of an individual response or sentence. And now I kind of get to some of the results. The first figure I'm showing here is really just showing you the sentiment measure. And there's two ones that we typically focus on here, the fine-tuned BERT, human labeled, and fine-tuned BERT production data, and compare that to kind of month-over-month IP growth. Probably could have done 3-month changes in IP growth to kind of get rid of some of that volatility, but you're going to see that over the time period, we're getting a correlation close to half for the relationship between these sentiment measures and industrial production growth. So there's something there, and it kind of moves with IP over the business cycle. But IP is a little bit more volatile. Month-to-month production changes quite a bit. Maybe more importantly, and this kind of goes to one of the big conclusions we like to take away from this paper, which is if you're going to compare the PMI, which is an aggregate, basically it's the published ISM measure. It's an aggregate of kind of production and inventories and new orders over the different numerical classifications. We're going to compare that PMI index, so basically that's the published ISM measure, to our sentiment metrics. And kind of the one thing that jumps out, or should jump out, this is very highly correlated, about 0.7 to 0.8. And they move together over the business cycle. It looks like kind of the PMI index sort of responds to shocks a little bit differently. That's something we should probably spend a little bit more time looking at. But the two measures move together and look very similar in many ways, and have very high correlation. So if you want to kind of take away one point, that we're able to say, just using the text responses of individual organizations, we find that we can recreate something like the PMI index with our sentiment indices. So kind of diving a little bit into the forecasting, I'm not going to go through all the individual answers here, but I think one thing you should just think about is that the ISM sentiment measure we have here is significant across different measures of sentiment and different specifications. And so what we see here is that when you think about including the PMI, which is kind of the published numerical responses, including sentiment allows us to do a better job of forecasting. So the stability and transformer models do really well in sample. Basically, I can ask a firm to give me a numerical sort of response on how they're doing, but I can also ask them some questions, and there's value in the freeform text and their numerical responses. So that sentiment, that text that they put, gives us more additional information about the future than just their numerical responses. We find that same thing happens out of sample. So kind of just focusing on the out of sample results, we see that there is a decline in your root mean squared errors, which is what's being shown here in the bars. So that the root mean squared error shows that there's, as you add sort of these sentiment measures, we get out of sample forecasting improvement. It's kind of the stability and transformer models do particularly well. Adding newspaper sentiment to these specifications doesn't change things that much. And then we're kind of trying to think about doing, instead of doing Diebald-Mariano test statistics, we're exploring sort of the nesting of the out of sample models to make sure that we're getting the right test statistics. And as of right now, it looks like this all still lines up, depending on, not depending on how we measure sort of the improvement of out of sample forecasting. So we have all those results in hand. Basically, we're saying that, look, this additional sentiment measure provides value, but it's kind of hard to interpret this. So BERT, has many advantages. It picks up word context, has great forecasting performance, but it's really hard to understand where this value is coming from. Where is the value of that sentiment originating from? What words is it that have value? And so kind of the question we ask is like, look, is there any way of kind of digging deeply into this BERT black box and finding out what words matter, recreating that index with something like a dictionary, and trying to find out, where the marginal improvement comes from? And the quick answer we find is actually yes. And how do we do it? We kind of employ Shapley values to do this. So what that is essentially is that you're able, through sort of an iterative process of adding and subtracting words to kind of sentiment classifications, to kind of get a contribution of each word to a comment score. We're using Shapley decompositions to do this. And what's good about that is it sort of has this additive property. And then we come up with sort of this time invariant average contributions for each word. So we go through all the words, about 10,000 different words in the corpus of text responses, and find out which ones have the kind of power or their ability, that each one was to have the larger kind of marginal values in Shapley score context, and then sort of say, let's just look at the words that have lots of positive scores and high negative scores, and think about them, and just look at those and see if we can recreate an index. And that's our step 3. Really just keep these extreme value words, take the top and bottom 5% of words that account for most of the action, and see if we can recreate the index. This next table, which is a wonderful table that should be looked at in the paper, because it tells you sort of the average net positive or average net positive scores. So it shows you the top positive words and the top negative words, really that top and bottom parts of the distribution. And you can see what words are driving most of the sentiment scores. Think of that sort of score as giving you sort of its contribution to either positive or negative sentiment. And the positive words, things like specials, improved, excellent, and booming, are going to be adding value, or adding sort of adding significance to that part of the top of the distribution. The negative words, things like weak, inability to decline, unstable, errors, those are the words that sort of contribute substantial negatives to these indices over time. So what we do is we say, okay, we have the top and bottom of the negative and positive words. Can we just choose that part of the distribution and recreate the index? So not only can we recreate sort of the PMI from sentiment, but we can actually use Shapley values to decompose which words are important, and using just those words, we can recreate our sentiment index. So basically jump back to the context of having a dictionary type approach, fine-tuned, sorry to not abuse that term, but fine-tuned for an environment in which you're looking at individual purchasing managers' feelings about or sentiment about the manufacturing sector, and come up with a constant word level sentiment index using the top and bottom 5% of words, and you basically get back to something very close to that index. We kind of come to an interpretable index using that Shapley value approach, which is really neat, and it's a really great way of kind of coming full circle at the end of this work. So where are we now? We got this new useful data from the ISM. It's a long time series, and it is providing freeform text in addition to numerical answers. It really covers the operation of manufacturers. We show that the transformers do a much better job of classifying these really specific purchasing manager type comments. And we find that adding the sentiment measure to our forecasting framework, it has forecasting power. It reduces out of sample mean squared error, and it's particularly important. I didn't go into that much here for the great financial crisis. So when you see a big shift in kind of the a turning point in the economy, these measures actually become even more important, and we're able to kind of recreate that sentiment index just based on individual words, looking at Shapley values. And so we're trying to go and take this a little bit more in the future, is kind of take on a lot of comments and kind of revise the paper. But also we're going to be turning more towards sort of non-manufacturing, which should have more important context and information for the overall economy, and then thinking about still how we're recreating a statistical measure using just sentiment scores. So with that said, I will say thank you very much and happy to hear the discussion and take comments.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. That's brilliant. So let me hand over now to Hannah, who's going to offer some discussants' comments.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to hopefully present my slides. Do let me know when you can see that. Perfect, I can see a thumbs up. Thank you so much. So first of all, I should clarify upfront that I'm not an expert in time series, forecasting, or data science techniques. So I'll definitely be leaving the technical discussions to the audience. But I do want to say that I am responsible for a large proportion of the business surveys and monthly economic indicators at ONS. And I'm very lucky to work with talented multidisciplinary teams to deliver these, some of whom are on the call. So I'm delighted to be part of the webinar and reflect on really the art of the possible for how we might use this research, I think, in ONS and what we kind of currently do. So I won't go through all of my reflections. I think Chris gave an excellent overview, both on the kind of strategic aims and the technical approach taken. The things I wanted to pick up on as kind of key reflections from me was clearly the research shows that there's a strong relationship between the PMI and the industrial production growth, and it really does illustrate the importance or the potential use of this data as a leading indicator. I also wanted to pick up, I thought it was really interesting, there was actually quite a relatively small subset of words that really did kind of explain and drive that variation in the index, in the sentiment index. And then finally, the point I wanted to really thank Chris and the team for is, I think the comparison of methods and the empirical results presented can really help researchers both in ONS and across the globe, hopefully, think about what approach they might use in using some of this text analysis, where we've got a plethora in our ONS surveys, for example. And I thought I'd jump straight in to talk a little bit about one of the surveys that I'm responsible for that we run in ONS, which is our Business Insights and Conditions survey. It's a little bit similar, and it's a bit dissimilar to other surveys we run in ONS, but a little bit similar to the survey you described, I think, Chris, where we ask kind of a range of, we ask businesses to answer a range of topics, given them fairly structured. Has your turnover, for example, increased, decreased, stay the same, as well as some structured questions on giving some reasons why. We also have a free text box in there where they also are able to kind of tell us a little bit more unstructured data, and we're keen to really use that a little bit more. So as I said, the slide here really does just show two topics, turnover and prices, which are obviously kind of key to thinking about our kind of leading indicators for GDP and how that might work, how that might change and impact over time. But that survey does cover a range of other themes across several waves, such as trade, supply chains, labour, and workforce costs, for example. Because we do ask businesses ahead of time what their expectations are, and we've also got what they've reported on, we're able to do that kind of similar kind of firm level prediction, I think, but really using the firm as the predictor. So what are they actually getting it right, as well as the potential then to increase and understand some of the other comments. So I just wanted to just give one example here, where we see for manufacturing industries and companies within the manufacturing industry, there is obviously good kind of correlation, and they seem obviously the people's expectations and what they experience in reality or what they report in reality are aligned, but maybe businesses tend to be a bit more optimistic ahead of time. So that's quite an interesting thing for us to consider. So how do we actually currently use the free text comments in ONS now? Pretty basic, kind of similar to what you said in the beginning of your presentation, Chris, in terms of we really use it to validate the kind of survey responses and the estimates that we see, and for that context setting. That involves a lot of manual searching in the kind of files that we can access, looking for one-off events or weather kind of conditions, things that really come up as part of our briefing or curiosity sessions around the statistics. And we do publish those sometimes for context in the same way as the example you showed. So for example, earlier in the year, we published a statement that kind of confirmed that businesses were commenting that actually their prices and themselves, they'd be affected by increases in employer national insurance contributions, which are being implemented later this year. We also have some examples of where we use more kind of counts and themes, so a bit more like the sentiment dictionary approach. So for 2 of our surveys, for example, we published just the counts by kind of high level themes, and we also published a time series by a different breakdown of themes as well. So again, more contextualizing, I think, in terms of rather than predicting, but a helpful way to use some of this data that otherwise we wouldn't use. So now moving on to the opportunities, I think the paper and the presentation today has really demonstrated how we could do so much more with the free text data. If I take our monthly business survey, and I should explain that, as I said at the beginning of this slide here, stakeholders are really keen to understand the sentiment from our surveys. They really want to know, policymakers and so on really want to understand how they can use this information both as context, but also as a kind of indication of what might be coming. Our monthly business survey is kind of one of our largest monthly surveys, covers production and services, and has a large sample each month. As I said there, it covers around 44% of the economy. And we do ask businesses to provide a comment on whether they can describe the changes in total turnover in more detail. On some analysis, we certainly don't get the level of kind of response against those comments that you're seeing in your example there. It's around 20 to 25% by the time you clean out some of the not applicable and other type of responses. But that is a huge amount still every month to potentially use and explore. What we're also doing is improving our toolkit to automate the identification of themes that emerge from these text fields. At the moment, as I mentioned earlier on the last slide, there's a lot of having to dig in, go and search for specific keywords that we're looking for, whereas we'd like to have that automated in a bit more detail and have it at the kind of start of our production round. I was going to say coincidentally, but I feel like this is possibly more as a follow-on from maybe ESCoE conferences and discussions you've had in the past. We are working with the data science campus at the moment to explore how we can best analyse this data and see it as being quite complementary really to our big structured questions, where you have those kind of tick boxes where businesses say what some of the challenges are, maybe either to context and potentially as a predictor. So I'm going to very quickly give some of my considerations at the end now, in terms of particularly this is thinking about how we might use them for ONS. So obviously the research really effectively bridges the gap between the kind of qualitative sentiment analysis and the production of official statistics or economic forecasting, and gives a really novel perspective on using unstructured data to inform business and policy decisions. But I think there are some considerations of how we might use the similar kind of techniques in ONS. Things that you've already addressed is things like the fact that these are maybe black boxes, and for some of our users, that's quite hard for us to explain. The reliance on human labeled data, I think for the fine-tuning, would be interesting to see how we'd need to scale that for so many comments, and again, really keen for a discussion with the audience potentially on how we might do that. We know that the comment boxes are voluntary for ONS surveys, as I'm sure for others, and we don't perhaps need to do a bit more work to understand the coverage and the quality of comments in there. And one example I was thinking of there is really understanding the sentiment a bit more. So are they actually talking about business performance in the market, or actually some of the comments that I've read, just from it kind of having a quick exploration, sometimes can give more of a sentiment around political views or the government itself. And so just trying to understand and kind of adjust for that might be interesting. But my final comment is really this demonstrates a really significant opportunity, I think, to integrate these type of techniques with traditional economic indicators. I'm very keen to learn and collaborate across the whole community. So I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully leave plenty of time for questions.
Thanks, Hannah. Chris, do you want to respond to any of those points at all?
That's great. I just say just a couple things is that, like, I know the kind of the lower response rates that you're seeing kind of for the BICs, but like so many observations too. That's just really great. And I'd be fascinated to see how, if you did kind of extract sentiment, to see how you were able to kind of recreate some of those headline indexes. Also, I guess, maybe this goes back to my point about how fast and how technology has changed, but it's being able to create kind of an internal generative AI behind a firewall so that kind of individual responses are kept sort of confidential, would allow you to jump pretty quickly ahead of what we had to do in terms of putting together individual sort of economist responses to what that response was saying. So you could actually have generative AI run through those pretty quickly to come up with sort of your fine-tuned sentiment models, which would be great. And then just kind of just reiterating this fact that, like, if you had this sort of sentiment index, I do find it provides value. If you sort of have that in hand, you kind of know a little bit more about what the future index will look like. So you'll kind of see turning points a little bit quicker, and I think that's important for consumers of economic statistics. So I'd be really interested to kind of see how you guys move this forward, and it just seems really great that you're thinking about this.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. I encourage others to put their questions forward. Let me just ask a couple of things quickly, and then I'll turn to the Q&A. I'm interested in understanding how people who respond in this with their text comments in this survey interact with each other and interact with other agents. So what role do you think social media plays in creating kind of contagious narratives that then might appear in the text analysis as perhaps some of those top 5% words, so very optimistic, very negative sentiments? That's my first question. So how respondents kind of interact with each other. And then secondly, thinking about central banks are involved in communication, particularly around policy, and the purpose is to feed into sentiment and to influence the expectations and sentiment of business. So to what extent do you think central bank words have leverage on the responses of businesses, and is there any way that you can test for that?
Get to the second one first.
Sure.
I think that's a really neat question. Like, you should be able to do that work, that research, ask that question, and see if there's kind of a feedback loop between the language employed by policymakers and speeches and what we're seeing show up in the responses of these individual kind of purchasing managers. That's pretty neat. Good. So it's a question that you should answer. So in terms of the feedback loop between organizations, I think one of the concerns would definitely be that, if something like this became more widespread and used, then you might see comments that are like, well, here's, hint, this is what you should be doing at sort of the policymaker level, or just understanding like these are the words that might kind of change the sentiment measure, and you'll see individual organizations kind of leveraging that. And those, I think, are concerns that are really valid and don't really have a good answer to that, because, as measures like this might become more important, you might see this kind of strained endogeneity between sort of, desired policy outcomes and words that are being used. What I guess this kind of goes back to my, excitement about what what kind of Hannah said about BICS is like, I'm assuming with a large enough sort of sample, you might kind of filter through that. But like on our end, I mean, the ISM has very well curated high response rates, but they don't have such a thick sample.
Yeah, thanks for that. So could I encourage Eugene Chang to unmute and ask the question that they've put in the Q&A? Okay, well, perhaps I'll read the question. So the question says, two technical questions. Given the text comment data over 100 years, did you have any concerns on word usage meanings changing over time? And secondly, you labeled 1,000 samples. How many labeled samples do you think would be enough to stabilize the quality of your predictive models? So two questions there from Eugene.
I do. Oh.
Sorry, my microphone wasn't working, but I just wanted to jump in and say I really enjoyed this work, and I'm from the OECD, and we're very interested in looking at business cycle indicators and industrial production as well. And so I was kind of interested in some of the implementations, and also I was very interested in the ONS comments, because actually I used to work in UK government, and I've worked a bit on big free text. So this is all really fascinating. So sorry, just a quick interjection. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thanks for the questions. I think we have to do more work on understanding kind of new words and how the value of those words change. We kind of, when we do the Shapley analysis, is kind of assuming constancy, but you could imagine doing sort of like kind of rolling correlations where you kind of look at how words' importance changes over time, and how words kind of increase and decrease in sort of their importance and their Shapley values. And that gives you, that's sort of that would be the mechanism at which I think we could do that work. Haven't done it, need to do it. Very interesting question. We're using 1,000 to how much I think the second question was how many should you kind of hand label to have stability? Was that sort of the question? And
yeah, exactly.
I think we felt 1,000 was enough, but I don't know if that's enough kind of to confidently say that it's stable. And I think one of the benefits of, if like say we had to redo this now, I guess conditional on saying you have an internal version of Llama or an internal generative AI behind a firewall, so that you could look at sort of confidential information and ensure its let's say security, and kind of avoiding disclosure. I think you'd be able to do a little bit more, a little bit faster, in kind of getting some way of looking at multiple samples and changing those samples over time to see where you can get that stability. But when you're kind of just having hand labeling, you probably can't do a good enough job at changing that count to see how you get that stability. But I think now we can, and that's kind of a great thing to attempt to answer.
I wonder whether Zachary Payne-Thompson would like to unmute and just ask two questions listed in the Q&A, maybe concisely ask one of those or two of those.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, I think I've been actually doing something very similar to this as part of another project, but as like a separate project, but looking at Parliament data and seeing if it can look at public sentiment. The signal is much less strong because people don't, it's not as attached to what people talk about in Parliament is very noisy. There's lots of stuff there. But one thing that I wanted to try and do was, I tried to just see if the forecasting accuracy could be improved by doing feature engineering on that sentiment index. So I was wondering if you looked at like lags of sentiment, or looking at changes in sentiment rather than levels, or creating other measures like volatility or momentum. That's one question. And then the second question was, I might have missed this because I dropped out for a second, but did he perform any of unsupervised exploration on the semantic content of the responses, conditional on other factors, like, for example, whether they were positive or negative sentiment, or on the types of responder, or on the period in time, or other types of categorizations as well?
So kind of on the second one, we haven't, and we should. And that's kind of where, thinking a little bit more about that unsupervised part is going to be important. And I think for future work, I think looking at sort of the other moments, and I think this is kind of what you're getting at, is like there's, instead of just thinking about the level of sentiment, but let's really think about sort of like a sentiment Gini coefficient in a way, like just thinking about let's get to uncertainty here, because I think that's where there's going to be even a lot more value. If we're thinking about like economic policy uncertainty as a driver of investment decisions and kind of employment decisions, then the level is important because sentiment says something about uncertainty, but really we should be able to dive deeper, and that's sort of the next stage of this process, of this kind of research agenda, is to say, now let's really get at what might be driving investment decisions and what might be driving like firm action and inaction. And hopefully, I think we'll see a lot more of that as we get past just thinking about levels.
Great. Well, our time has gone. Chris, I think that's a great comment to end on. There's so much more to be done, so many more interesting questions to answer, and really fascinating presentation. And if Hannah, if we do get to work with the data science campus and explore the big data, I'm sure that the audience will be very interested to see that work as well.
Bring it back and share.
Yeah. So thank you very much to Chris and to Hannah and to the audience for the attending and asking interesting questions. Just to flag up, there is another ESCoE webinar coming up on the 13th of March, 12 till 1, by Hugh Dixon, looking at seasonally adjusted UK inflation. So that's on the 13th of March. See some of you there. So nice to see you. Thank you for coming.
Thanks a lot, all.
Thanks all.
Okay. Bye-bye.